Hi, I'm Jennifer Bradley. I'm the director of the Center for Urban Innovation at the Aspen Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion on admitting, understanding, and learning from failure in local government. The question of failure and the more important question of what happens after failure has been something of an obsession of mine since I started the Center for Urban Innovation about 5 years ago. Everything I was learning about innovation said that failure was an important part of the innovation process. But at the same time, I heard, as so many of you have heard, that local governments have zero tolerance for failure. And we all know that can't be true. I am a die-hard champion of local government and have the greatest and most enduring respect for the people who devote their energy, intelligence, patience, and drive to making our counties, cities, states, and towns places of opportunity and delight. But I see, and we all see, large and small examples of local governments falling short, particularly now in the era of COVID-19 and increased calls for racial justice. So the question is not whether we tolerate or don't tolerate failure. As I said, the question is what happens next. How can local governments acknowledge failure and use it to learn and do better? As many of you know, on Tuesday, the Center for Public Impact and the Center for Urban Innovation released a report on this subject, which is the culmination of in-depth research and 6 intensive workshops, which we called Failure Foundries, with cities and counties around the country. And we'll drop a link to this report in the comment window. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with the CPI team and with people in local government who brought an enormous amount of courage and honesty to our workshops to engage in a really scary topic. We had hoped that Mayor Quentin Lucas, the mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, would be able to join us today to give some insights into what it feels like.
He has joined us.
And he has joined us. This is extraordinary. This is why on a webinar about failure, you can expect it to go any way. So Mayor Lucas, we are so glad you could join us. We had the honor of working with 3 Kansas City departments at one of our earliest failure foundries. Mayor Lucas is a lifelong Kansas Citian, a professor at the University of Kansas School of Law, and a former city council member for the historic 18th and Vine Jazz District. The mayor took office on August 1st, 2019, so his first year as mayor has been quite intense. Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, and it is such an honor to work with you all again. I look forward to the time when we can spend some time together in person and have a chance to have great follow-ups and all of that interaction we miss, but we will get through it well today and now. A few things that I wanted to mention. First of all, I am just about at my 1-year anniversary as mayor of Kansas City. And my gosh, it has been interesting every step of the way. I thought that the Super Bowl victory for my Kansas City Chiefs would kind of be the one big first-year thing that I had to remember, celebrate, and discuss. And then we saw the world change before our eyes, and roughly only about a month later. As we dealt with the COVID pandemic, then we moved on to protesting in our streets, policing issues, real questions that are fundamental about what government does, what's the role of law enforcement, and we've addressed those and we're trying to deal with them. All the while, we also have the day-to-days, ranging from potholes to a city manager hiring to all the things you would expect of a big city mayor. And so I'll look at some of those things in our discussion today. I usually speak without notes, but because this was an important group and it's hard to talk about failure sometimes, I had to actually write something down on it because you're used to, in your speeches, saying all these things that we've done well. But moments for reflection, I think, are so essential, at least to how I get by each day and certainly how many of us do. So I'll start kind of with some of the failures that we've had. When I was running for mayor more than a year ago, my big position was to make our city safer. Kansas City, like Chicago, like Baltimore, St. Louis, a number of others, faces an epidemic of gun violence, and particularly gun violence in our Black community. Last year, 150 people were killed by firearm. In comparison, I believe the city of New York was about 244. There are 8 million people, we're 505,000. It is a very significant challenge for us. We also, and in an almost heartbreaking way, right, we looked at homicides, but non-fatal shootings were roughly 500 people, or an amazingly high number of Kansas Cityans were actually just shot last year. It's a challenge. So when I was running, I said, my goal is to get the homicide rate in Kansas City below 100. This year, we're already at 111, and it's August 6th. We won't hit that deadline, that goal. The question for me is, why won't we? Now, in a world, you can have a lot of excuses, and I can say COVID-19 has ended so much of our programming, and it's been difficult working with the Trump Department of Justice and Bill Barr, which is true, and more on that in a moment. But really, to me, the answer is that no, we were unsuccessful in really rolling out new initiatives and getting to the root of what is our violent crime challenge. While we're not unique in American cities in doing that, we have to make sure we're not letting the excuses perpetuate the cycle of violence that we see in our cities. The reason mayoral candidate Quentin Lucas said we're going to get below 100 wasn't because I was sure it would happen, but it was because I was sure that mayors need to change what their rhetoric is. We can't just be ribbon cutting folks. We can't just celebrate sports teams. We can't just celebrate if you're in Baltimore, the Inner Harbor, if you're in St. Louis, the Gateway Arch, if you're in my city, barbecue. We have to also make sure that we're saying, how do we address these long-term concerns that make it so difficult to live in the American city sometimes? And so with that, I hope in our next year, not necessarily that we just change the numbers, but instead that we actually change what our focus is. I referenced a moment ago in our list of our discussion of failures working with the White House and the Attorney General's office. And recently we had a not insignificant amount of egg on our face in connection with a federal operation by the name of Operation Legend. That's an operation that has been rolled out already in Chicago, Kansas City, and Albuquerque, but it started in our city. And the way it started speaks to, in some ways, a failure of administrative leadership in my own office. So we've been busy of late. I had a meeting with police hierarchy, a big police commission meeting, where we were talking about a number of reforms. And I largely told my staff, don't bother me with anything. So during the time that they're not bothering me, the United States Attorney for this district text messages a member of my office and says, hey, we have a new DOJ operation. Would you like to be a part? We don't get many details, but my general counsel, she writes up a letter. We send it back to the U.S. Attorney's Office, which gets to the Attorney General, which gets to the White House. And then the next day at the White House press briefing, it is announced by White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany that due to a request from the mayor and the governor, there will be a new federal operation where they're sending hundreds of forces to help us fight violent crime. And of course, as a mayor, you would say, good God, right? At the time, and still, there were significant questions about federal involvement in ending protests in Portland. There are always discussions about federal involvement in terms of, are you respecting local authorities or not? And so it seemed like a mission that was to take over control of an American city, and it fit with the president's rhetoric of there are deadly policies by deadly politicians. And so many were asking, Lucas, did you do this? To which I had to say, well, not really. And thus then leads to another long, convoluted discussion where I got an editorial actually in my hometown newspaper where they said, my first name is Quentin, in case you're wondering, where the headline was, is Quintonian to Clintonian? And I got an unfavorable piece, although it's often nice to be compared to presidents sometimes. But the piece said, you know, our mayor reminds us of Bill Clinton saying, it matters what the definition of is. And so you look at that situation and you say, well, what did we do wrong? And there are a number of things. One was a pure office organizational issue, right? If you don't give your office and your staff the ability to look to situations in which things should be elevated, then you run into situations like this. Another was a longer protocol type of thing of what do we look to when we're having communications with the federal government in whatever level it's represented. And then the other is, how do we actually respond in a way that is clear? So often in life, and I think as we think about failures, this is something we all have to speak to. We want to defend ourselves. We want to defend our rhetoric because we do think we did the right thing. I just had, and part of the reason for my roughly 90-second delay on getting on was that I just had a city council member in my office. She is a white woman in her 60s and recently got accused of making a racist remark from the floor of our city council chambers. She did not see race in it. The black councilwoman whom she was addressing does. And now there are a number of community groups that are calling for her resignation. I was letting her know that she needed to apologize, but she was saying, I don't have a racist bone in my body. Why would anyone attack me like this? You didn't say anything, Mayor, when this other white council member said something preposterous 6 months ago or a year ago. And we had to just tell her, that's not what it's about. It's about owning up to our own failures and our own concerns. While I was trying to rationalize the reason my office would send a letter for an operation we didn't support, I had to sit back and say, wait, does it matter? Does it actually matter? Or instead, can you actually tell people, well, look, these are the steps I'm doing to make sure it doesn't become Portland. These are the steps I'm taking to make sure that we don't see something like that happen again. And fundamentally, these are the steps I'm taking to make Kansas City safer, which is really the core issue that everyone was trying to address. And so those are the things that I've learned from that issue in the middle of still dealing with a pandemic and policing issues and violence and protests, right? You have to keep adjusting. And the other thing that I think is important for all of us who are busy human beings, which I imagine most of you are, is that being busy is no excuse, right? We try to sometimes say, oh my gosh, the children are the issue or so many others, but we still have a job to do and a job to perform. And part of that job is saying when we were wrong and how we can do better. And I'll use another example, and that relates to the pandemic itself. One example is kind of funny and humorous. Another example is more grave. And so the more humorous one is this. I have issued a mask order, and I issued a requirement that masks be worn inside everywhere in Kansas City. My state still has not issued a mask order, even though our cases are increasing rapidly. The state next to me, Kansas, also, the governor tried to issue a statewide mask order. The legislature reversed her decision. And so we were kind of this shining star in middle America of the importance of mask orders and issuing them early. All was good. Well, after a few weeks of protests and other challenges, I had a friend who invited me out on their boat. I'm starting to sound like I have a Kennedy scandal. I promise it isn't that bad. But so I go out on the boat and I'm talking to a friend and all of that. And then I get off and I'm on the dock, just standing and waiting, but without a mask. And it's fine because no one's there. But then about 7 women spot me and they say, oh my gosh, it's the mayor of Kansas City. It's the mayor. And they say, oh my gosh, can we have a picture? I can't find a mask because I was just on a boat, but I am a politician after all, right? So you're always used to the picture with the kids or the nice ladies, and these women were probably about 20 to 25 years my senior. And so I said, sure, I'm outside after all, there's no issue. So I take a picture, and then on Sunday night, everything blows up. Then there's a newspaper story, television images, because I did the worst thing possible in politics, which is you have an image of you screwing up. And so once again, I had the chance to say, instead of, and this is a sign of learning, right? Instead of rationalizing, instead of saying I was on a dock or I was just getting off a boat, I'm still wet. I said, you know what? I screwed up and I should have had my mask on. And in some ways, similar to the councilwoman I was just talking about, I wanted to say, well, my governor actually just aggressively doesn't wear masks, nor do my senators and all these others. But, actually the message I want was it's important and I should have had it and I didn't. And how do we move on to make sure other people do? And how do we move on to say that people aren't perfect? And I think if there's anything that I have learned, whether it be pretty much the daily challenge of being a mayor, I will tell you, as someone who was a city council member a year and a half ago, it is very different. I've been in public office, but nobody cared what I did before for the most part. Whereas now, right, you're seen, sometimes you're on television. I've had a few national television hits. I was in a recent interview on CNN, but the more interesting one was on Fox News with Chris Wallace, where we had an interesting battle about the administration. But I have to realize that, yes, I have a different platform now. And rather than using the platform to, in some ways, build a cult of identity and defensiveness, and there have been mayors that have been bedeviled by it. For those of you who are in Washington, you'll remember the travails of Marion Barry, who, even though, right, he might have had a number of interesting ideas for the people of Washington, and he was largely doomed not just by his own personal demons, but by his own need to justify and rationalize what were, in some ways, largely objectively flawed behaviors. I think it's important for many of us to actually say, okay, what am I trying to accomplish each day? And accomplishment isn't just how do I make Mayor Lucas look good or feel good or defend myself, but instead, how do I make my community safer? How do I make my community healthier? How do I make sure that we're doing right by our city? And the amazing thing that I've seen in my just year of office is how much positive attention will come your way if you focus on those, right? My national TV hits or interviews have nothing to do with me being able to say, hey, everybody loves me. I have a 95% approval rating, which I do not. And in fact, it drops precipitously by the day. It's amazing when you do things a lot, then the criticism certainly comes your way. But instead, that attention comes from somebody who's trying, somebody who's working hard, somebody who's showing a streak of independence, somebody who's working across the aisle at a time when it isn't necessarily popular. And that's what I think all of us need to focus on more. I said I had another pandemic example, and I do. And this related to when we were reopening. And I remember that we were reopening far too soon. And in the Midwest and the Southwest, for those of you who are in these parts of the country, you're seeing that example. And to me, the challenge has been, well, how do we continue to make sure that we're bringing other people aboard of our efforts? And so when we were reopening, we said, we're only going to allow reopening at a 10% capacity for no more than 10 persons. And if you stayed somewhere for 10 minutes, you had to sign in and make sure things were easier for contact tracing. We stood by that issue. While people were saying that Lucas is a Nazi, which was an attack, and I received a lot of hate mail, we said this is to help stem the tide of the pandemic. Those efforts have continued to make Kansas City healthier than a number of cities near us, other Midwestern cities, and it's something I'm proud of. And so sometimes recognizing failure is recognizing when you have to just kind of say what's right and wrong. And other times it's actually standing up for what you believe in. Every step of the way we've tried to do that. And we've tried to get a lot of the politics and the marketing out of it. And that's what I think all of us need to do as we look to survive a pandemic, as we look to survive a moment of racial reconciliation, as we look to see what the American city and frankly what our country will be like long after this moment is over. With that, I say thank you so much, and I've enjoyed the opportunity to visit with you.
Thank you so much, Mayor Lucas, for that extraordinary story of candor and integrity on some of the most hot button issues of our day. In just a few minutes, we heard stories about the biggest issues that we're facing: race, policing, and COVID-19. And I hope that everyone watching appreciates this example of facing failure, being honest, and as we say, asking what's next, and continuing to do what needs to be done for constituents in the country as a whole. So we are extremely grateful for the time that you were able to share with us.
Thank you.
Now we have a superb panel to talk about creating a culture of constructive failure in local government. We're going to drop their bios in the chat so that we can spend more time talking amongst ourselves and less time talking about ourselves. So I'm going to start with a question for Tina Walla, who is the Chief Innovation Officer in the City of Seattle. As all of you know, Tina, as you know all too well, Seattle was once the epicenter of COVID-19. How did that change the context for experimentation, failure, and innovation in your city government?
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to CPI and Aspen Institute for hosting this important conversation. Great question. And I'll start by saying that when in local government we think about innovation, it's because we want to be the first, we want to be able to say that we are the first city to do something. That was not the case in this situation. Being the initial epicenter of COVID-19 in the United States was extremely challenging, but it also unleashed an opportunity to innovate that did not allow for hesitation. Just to take you back, you may recall that in early March, when the Seattle area was seeing our counts go up and our deaths go up, there wasn't a lot of knowledge or evidence base in the global health community for us to tap into. And so what we had to do was take the information we did have and make the best decisions we could and take action. Because from our perspective, failure to take action and too much sort of overthinking literally could lead to lives being lost. So for us, we had to accept that failure was a potential outcome, but we knew that sort of following the spirit of experimentation, if I can say, that was the name of the game. Trying things out, iterating, changing course if things didn't work. But we very clearly got direction from our mayor, Mayor Jenny Durkin in Seattle, to try anything and to continue iterating, because at the end of the day, we had residents who we were really concerned about. I'll end there.
Great, thanks so much. Jessica Boccardo is a partner at Boston Consulting Group, who has throughout the course of her career worked with many levels of government. Jessica, I'm wondering, are the changes that were brought by COVID, so Tina's point that there's a finding that right point between thinking too much and doing too little, have you seen changes that you think will persist and become structural in local government? And could those either help innovation, or do you see that there's a spirit of conservatism, small c, not political, that might hinder innovation? Conservatism meaning a resistance to change, nothing political in there.
Okay, thanks, Jen, for that question, and thank you all for attending and for this great panel. So let me start stating the obvious, which is COVID-19 has disrupted the government big time. I think less obvious is to really think about what changes will stick. I think I will highlight 3 key changes that I've seen and I think have the potential to have a large impact in how governments operate for the longer run. So the first one is around, as we've seen in many, many sectors, not only government, but this acceleration towards more digital. This takes 2 forms. One is we see more remote work, but in government it has been even more surprising because there's some jobs and some tasks that we never thought that were going to be done online. Just to give you an example that I know everyone is aware of, is like the US Supreme Court hearing for the first time, via Zoom doing hearings. So that was, first time in history that happened. And many people have said that's impossible 6 months ago. And the second form that digital acceleration is taking is really about more digital services now being provided online. So there's more and more we're seeing states and local governments, and even in the federal level, services that are being provided online to enroll for many things, and then having more information that is in apps, etc. The second big change that I think maybe gaining some momentum is a larger role of government. So I think we see, with this unprecedented thing that COVID brought about, there's also an unprecedented response from government in terms of historic levels of stimulus packages and so on. But this has also shown some cracks in the system, right? We see a disproportionate effect and impact on some populations like Black and Latins. We also see maybe, okay, the healthcare system could be better. So I think there is potential momentum for the government to maybe address some imbalances and potentially, start delivering services for all. Maybe that's wishful thinking, but I've seen, some of those trends. And then let me just finish with the fact that COVID has shown the fragility of the system and societies, and there's more of an aim and an ask to think about how to build societies that are more resilient. So we see governments thinking now about supply chains. How can we build supply chains that are more resilient? In education, can we think about online education really working, and maybe can hybrid models really work? And I've seen very good solutions on upskilling and reskilling displaced workers. So I think overall I'm very positive and very optimistic, even though this is very sad moments, but I do think there's an opportunity for the government to reimagine itself.
Thanks so much, Jessica. One of the things that I've seen in my career is that process change is never fully successful unless it's accompanied by a culture change. And so for our next question, I want to turn to my good friend, Neil Kleeman, who is a public policy professor at New York University and director of NYU's Wagner Innovation Labs. Neil, you've done an enormous amount of work, particularly recently, on local government culture change. What are you learning about the kinds of culture changes that support innovation, that either respond to the moment that Tina found herself in early March, or these larger issues that Jessica just raised with us? And you're on mute, so if you wanted to go off mute, we could hear your great ideas. Perfect.
All right, can you hear me? Great. So thanks for that intro, and thanks for doing this report. Because really, if you're talking about embracing failure, learning from failure, it's about how organizations work and how they do their work. And there's so little done on that topic. So I'm glad that this report is out there. And as you said, I've been doing a lot of research on organizational culture myself for the last 2 years. I have been involved in a project with Bloomberg Philanthropies and the Harvard City Leadership Initiative and my NYU colleague, Alexander Shermansong, and it's wrapping up right now, and we learned a ton. And one of the reasons we learned so much is there's almost nothing written about organizational culture. And we went into this assuming that there was a lot out there, because in the business literature and amongst business executives, there's so much discussion of what organizational culture means. Are you a caring, collaborative company like a Disney, or are you a ruthless disruptor like an Uber? There are all these books out there like Who Moved My Cheese and others, and the Harvard Business Review and Fast Company, and on and on and on, but almost nothing about how public sector organizations can change the work that they do. And this is critical because culture drives everything. It is the unwritten rules that dictate how work gets done. And you can think of it a bit like the language of an organization. Everybody speaks it, but no one stops to identify what it is. And I learned just how important culture was when, before the pandemic locked us all up, I would go to different conferences, like conferences hosted by Aspen and others, and I would go around to colleagues and other aides and say, what's the biggest obstacle or barrier you found in terms of advancing innovative policy? And I heard again and again and again that it's organizational culture or some variation of that, whether that be HR rules, or work behaviors. So clearly, it's organizational culture that will stop innovation or learning from failure right in its tracks. And so to address that really has a lot to do with what the report says, which is how do you build trust? And building trust is almost synonymous with organizational culture improvement. And I would just mention 3 things here quickly. One is, and that's why I'm so glad we had Mayor Lucas, Kansas City is one of the places we looked at. It really starts with leadership, and leadership throughout the organization, but certainly at the top. So you need leadership that's crystal clear on the types of changes that are needed. And if we're talking about embracing failure, what exactly does that mean concretely, and having a narrative and a language that accompanies it. And then what's also so important, and I think often gets overlooked in the public sector, is training. And training can take many shapes and sizes. And one of the cities we looked at that was very impressive in this regard is Louisville, Kentucky. And there you had a lot of formal training that took place with the help of organizations like Toyota and Humana and others around Six Sigma, where there are established principles around organizational change, including embracing failure. But Louisville also had more informal training, more peer-to-peer training that was led and took root and helped to spread the ideas around organizational improvement. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Neil. Our report, as you mentioned, does have several markers of kind of cultural change. So I think that we are at an exciting point in the field where we're starting to build this body. So we'll have something in a few years, I hope, that's comparable to the business literature. And that's a great segue to ask a question of Sarah Hunter, who is Director of Public Policy at X, the Moonshot Factory. Sarah, you know, Neil mentioned that the business culture has a lot of storytelling, a lot of resources, a lot of research around failure. You often intersect or work at the intersection of government and business. What's translatable from the business sector to the public sector when we talk about failure?
Thanks for having me. That's a great question. I think, you know, X, just as context, is a sister company to Google. So, you know, when I talk with public sector organizations, there's often quite a lot of cynicism about the extent to which the innovation culture that we try to instill at X can be replicated within government. You know, we have a lot more money to play with, and we have a lot more risk tolerance, if you like, because it's not taxpayer money. And all of that is true. But I also think there's a lot of principles that are absolutely applicable, in fact, probably more so to the public sector than in the private sector. For example, the desire to experiment actually comes out of a recognition that the status quo isn't good enough. And there's no one who understands that better than the public sector. You know, often within Silicon Valley, we rather naively can see the failures of the existing status quo. We don't really understand it in the way that the public sector frontline staff do. Also, frankly, having money doesn't really help. Often having a lot of money means you just throw more people at
So we are having a little bit of lag with Sarah's audio. So I'm going to turn it
actually.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, now you're back. Great.
Oh, sorry. We had a project using delivery drones, and there we weren't really using the experimentation mindset appropriately. We were sort of propping up the demo with people and creating circumstances where actually we weren't learning as much as we should. Whereas when you don't have a lot of people and money to prop up demos, you actually really learn quickly what works and how to sort of iterate it for the next version. So I actually think the public sector, I mean, let's be honest, the moonshot was invented by the government. So it's not something that the private sector owns. And frankly, I think more big picture goals and sort of moonshots should be set by governments now more than ever, frankly.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And now I'll turn to Josh Soren, who is the Program Director for City Innovation at the Center for Public Impact, and one of the leading forces and minds behind this report, and it's been a great partner to work with throughout. As I was saying, Josh, you facilitated some of the failure foundries, which brought together department directors, mid-level managers, and frontline workers to talk about failure and the culture of their departments. Was there something that surprised you in those conversations?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jennifer. There were several things that surprised me. First and foremost, I think it's the degree to which the cultures and structures of government, which ostensibly were created to promote accountability and reduce risk, have done basically the exact opposite over time. This becomes, readily apparent from talking to people that work in government, particularly on the front lines, that by not having a culture where they can acknowledge failure, be honest about it, and by not having the structures through which they can share and communicate about those failures both across and within their departments, it's created more risk, not less. That risk is just much harder to see. And that's a problem for a lot of reasons that are readily apparent. But one of those is that, that risk, when you sweep it under the rug, so to speak, starts to develop accumulate debt, right? And basically what you're doing is you're trading acknowledgement of small failures in the short term. You're trading that for larger failures in the long term, and that's what leads to disasters. So that's the first thing that I think surprised me. It was just how apparent those structures and the culture of government have created that risk. I think the second thing that stuck with me, and it was probably a thing that really stuck with me most, was just a really intense strain that this type of culture of risk aversion has on the human relationships within government itself, not just between leaders and their direct reports, but between people at the same level. We had a quote in the report where we said 47% of participants said they rarely discuss mistakes and failures with their coworkers. That's pretty shocking, right? That you don't work in an environment where you can share what's going wrong with the people that you work with. You don't feel like you have that psychological safety within your culture where you can be vulnerable and be honest about what's going on, and either commiserate or share these experiences with your coworkers. And I think we've all worked in environments. I'm willing to bet we've all worked in environments, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector or the social sector, where we've had that type of environment, right, where we weren't able to share what was going on with us, either positive or negative. We had bosses that were really bringing the hammer down when there were failures, and that's just not a positive environment to work in, and it doesn't bring out the best in people. And I think if we want to tap into the really untapped potential of the workforce within government, it starts by, I think, creating a positive work environment where they can share what's working and what's not. And then on that last point, I would just say, to end on a positive note, there's the thing that I came away most inspired from our work was just the tremendous appetite and hunger for driving change at all levels within government, from the department leadership to people that work on the front lines. They know that there's a problem with culture, right? And they know that it leads to not the outcomes that they're looking for the residents that they serve. And they want to do something about it. They just need to be working in an environment that allows them to flourish and to do those things. So that's the thing I would say I came away with, is feeling daunted sometimes about the challenges that government workforces face, but also really inspired by their ability to drive that change and their desire to do so.
Thanks so much, Josh. And I will just add from my own experience, there was a sense of almost joy in the rooms where we held the failure boundaries,
Totally.
Almost a sense of relief that people were finally able to kind of be who they were and say what they knew, which gives me a lot of hope. And again, only adds to the respect I have for people who are doing this work every single day. Now we're going to open it up for a discussion, sort of the same question amongst the panelists. Tina, I'll go back to you. You were nodding vigorously at various points of the other folks' conversations. How do we take this culture change that we've been talking about, and certainly forced by some of the larger shaping changes that Jessica mentioned around moving to digital, greater needs, and the revelation of fragility? How do we take this culture change around failure and move it from department to department or from city to city? What might that look like in Seattle?
So I was nodding vigorously because the panelists have really touched on some key things that I see as critical. Neil touched on trust. Sarah talked about risk tolerance, and Josh was talking about the structures and highlighting one of the key themes in the Failing Forward report around human relationships. In response to your question, I'll say that one thing that I'm pretty passionate about is underscoring the need, the critical need, for management at all levels in an organization to be open about their own failures and to embody a growth mindset for their teams, to be able to lead by example and make space for reflection, candid conversations, and discussion. Doing that in a way that really helps staff understand that we shouldn't have to wait for one of these workshops for people to feel that sense of release, and that to have that opportunity to be open and candid about talking about failure, right? One thing we do in Seattle is we, within my team, we have quarterly step backs, and we use different models. One is a learning zones model, where with each of my colleagues, we talk through experiences that they've had where they were in the comfort zone, experiences where they were in the learning zone and sort of stretching themselves, and then when they're in the panic zone. And being able to have those conversations openly and say, hey, that's great that you're in the comfort zone. Let's push you a little bit. Let's try to lean into areas that may be less familiar to allow for that opportunity for innovation, and recognizing that failure may occur, and that's okay. The one thing I'll say that when I think about this culture change across departments within government, it's really key to remember that when we think about innovation and the possibility of failure, we really need to hold equity front and center to think about who is most burdened by that innovation, who's most affected by failure, and to really be mindful of that so that we're being thoughtful and intentional about how we're best sort of pushing the envelope on better serving our residents.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think it's from the top down, this sort of culture of embracing the value of failure comes, but it's also incredibly hard to do. I mean, you know, despite the fact I work in an organization which talks a lot about failure, which is in the valley where failure is sort of almost a brand of honor, you forget that it goes against everything we've been taught as children. We've always been taught to succeed. Like, we don't talk about failure with our families. We don't talk about failure with anyone. We're sort of always talking about how we're doing better, right? And so actually in our company, we do so many things to try and get people to go against their training of decades. And it's really, really hard to do. And I've noticed actually one of the things that we forget is that as leaders, we say like every organization should be ready to fail, and we run events where we get people to talk about it. We do a thing where we get people to write their failure resume. So write your resume as if you were sort of, you know, all the things you failed at. But as leaders, we're often very reluctant to be vulnerable enough to say, this is where I failed as well. And actually, it doesn't work if the leaders aren't prepared to admit to failure and to defend failure in the face of media criticism, in the face of, I mean, it's hard, but I do think it's the only way to do it, to be honest.
Neil, you had a reaction to that, and then we'll go to Josh.
Great. Can you hear?
Yep.
Excellent. So just 2 points here, and Sarah and Tina are exactly right. You know, learning from failure is it's very hard to do. So you have to recognize that. But 2 suggestions I would have, especially for leadership, is one is you need to break out of the A team. That typically it's those immediate aides right around a city manager, mayor, other municipal executive that feel as though they have the luxury to learn from failure, but nobody else does, right? And so one of the ways you can do this is to create cohorts of managers, deputy managers, and frontline administrators, without a doubt, who know that they have the ability to learn from what they're doing just as much as the executive team does too. The other thing I would say is that they're really, and this might even be harder than organizational change, which is that budgets need to have consequences, right? So let's say a department takes on this new approach and they learn from failure, but the budget is still the same year in and year out. Everybody else is just going to shrug their shoulders and say, why should we try? But the minute you make it clear that the budget does have consequences and the organization is learning from what it's doing, then you begin to see that innovation and that approach spread.
Josh, you had some thoughts, and then Jessica, I saw that you wanted to say something as well. You need to go off mute, Josh. There you go.
Great. Yeah, well, just building off of what Neil just said, I think first, the idea of democratizing innovation within local government is critically important. You know, oftentimes people feel that innovation is just the job of people that have innovation within their title. But that's not true. You know, improving government should be the role for everyone. And I think we need to start to see leaders empowering people on the front lines who know the problems best to drive that innovation. So as I love what you said, Neil, about kind of breaking out of the aid team. And then I think going back to a couple of things that were said before. So Tina talked about kind of the need for leaders to be vulnerable and engage people in conversation. And I think totally agree with that. And I think I would add on to that and say, but they also need to demonstrate results, right? And show that they're acting on the suggestions that they're receiving. Something that we heard a lot in the failure foundries that we did was people saying like, hey, you're not the first person to tell us that, and it's not the first director that we've worked with who's told us that like we should put forth our ideas and show us where the problems are. And guess what? We put forth ideas, it goes into the ether, and we never hear from it ever again. And so like, why is this time different? And so I think, talking about it, being vulnerable, leaders doing those things is the first step, but then they also tangibly need to act on those things. They need to demonstrate some results, not some early wins to show that change actually is going to happen. Because I think people, particularly on the front lines in government, are rightly skeptical of people coming in and saying, hey, we're going to change things. This is like the new regime. We're going to do things better. And then the final thing I would say to what Sarah was mentioning, and Sarah, I remember this when we interviewed you probably about a year ago for this report. I was asking you, how does the Moonshot Factory, how does X create this culture where people want to take risks and embrace it? And you were like, yeah, I mean, we have artwork on the walls, and we do failure pizza parties, and we have these conversations with people, and just kind of reinforce this idea. And I remember being struck by that, because it was these little changes, right? There was no silver bullet for creating the culture. It was these little changes that are reinforced over time again and again that really are the keys to kind of building that culture. But it's not easy work, even for X. And I think we saw that play out in the workshops a couple of times, right? Where people would be almost a little bit disappointed at times. They'd be like, wait, where's the big idea? Where's like the thing that's really going to drive this change? And it's like, well, first of all, you're the one that has to drive the change, not us. But second of all, there is no silver bullet. It is a lot of small incremental changes reinforced over time that create that culture. And it's hard work for sure.
Jessica, what are your thoughts on this?
So I think I don't want to add a lot. I think you all said many of the things I've seen, right? Leadership has to come from the top. Budgets matter. The only thing I would add, given my experience, I had an experience in a federal government, in an agency that had been doing, with a team that had been doing the same thing, the same way for 20 years. And when we came there and said, hey, can you do it differently? Can you do it faster? Their first response was like, no, we tried, it doesn't work, right? So we weren't thinking about like huge innovation, but just thinking about different ways of working. I think that did help tactically. We had leadership support, we had a budget, but still it was not, we were finding some obstacles. What worked really, really well, and what led to people say at the end of the project, like, I actually enjoy coming to my work right now because it's so much fun and I see things changing. One was we created cross working teams. So it was not just one agency or one team. We had like many other agencies, like the customers, right? So we created teams that had many different people. So what they thought they knew, well, they didn't really know, and they had to find that out by talking. So now the accountability was spread, and it really changed the dynamic. And what I would say is, like, we also realized that they needed some training. Like one day, suddenly we said, oh, we have to do things differently. Now we're going to do daily huddles, and you're going to be looking at outcomes. We actually had to show them learning by doing, right? Like we were working with them closely and showing them, because of course they have been doing the same thing for so many years. And suddenly we were changing the whole context for them. So I think I would only add those two things to all the great things everyone said.
Great. Our conversation has been so engaging to me but we do need to go to Q&A after this one question, and I'm going to encourage the panelists, it's coming, to answer it in one sentence. So in one sentence, this is everybody's big tweetable moment. What is the one thing that you want people to leave this webinar knowing? Neil, I'll go to you first. I know you've got to leave a couple of minutes early, so I want to make sure we hear from you.
I would say that metrics are the means to the end, right? That metrics, when you're looking at failure, can't be the end unto itself, but it has to be a path to understanding the organization and failure.
Great. Sarah, over to you.
Oh, I wish there was only one sentence I could have. I guess at a highest level, you're going to be the one person in 10 that actually makes a change. You're going to have to fail 9 times to get there.
That was a good sentence. Josh.
One sentence felt tough. Okay. In any complex system, failure is inevitable. It's just going to happen. And I think if you take that as a given and understand that failure is inevitable, the question then becomes, what are you going to do about it, right? Are you going to acknowledge it, or are you going to sweep it under the rug? And I think we as a society and as government and even in the private sector need to get better at acknowledging those failures and then doing something about it.
Great. Jessica.
So I would just say I've met the most passionate and committed people in the public sector, people who really want to make a difference. So how can we really leverage that, right? It's a strength. It's a superpower. So let's make sure we leverage that.
And we will close out by hearing from one of those really committed and dedicated superhero people. Tina.
So I think particularly with local governments, current fiscal situation in mind, I want us all to think about when government has to spend that next taxpayer dollar, that next dollar, when you're deciding where it goes, we have to do so with stewardship and equity at the forefront. And I think that that is an opportunity for partners like philanthropy and others to commit to working together and to thinking about where can government take risk and where might it be welcome for others to help us with taking that risk, recognizing we are the social safety net of our most vulnerable residents, and that is key to ensuring an equitable support system for residents.
Thanks so much. Now we are moving to audience questions. If you haven't had a chance to drop questions in the chat, please do now. This question is going to be a hybrid of one that was asked by Francisco Reynoso and one that was asked by Darren Bates, because they come to the same theme about what do you do if leadership is not like Mayor Lucas, if leadership is very resistant to failure, that if they are actively disincentivizing change. Jessica, in your experience, is there a way that you can intervene in the middle if leadership is not there, or should you just try to work somewhere else? You'll need to unmute yourself.
That's a great question. I wish there was a simple answer. I think you're starting with it's not the best context, right? I think as we all said, and we had the experts, the people with expertise in the ground, and then the theorists. That's the worst scenario. Like leadership, starting with leadership support is kind of a necessary condition. What I would say is, I think there's also a rethinking of who is leadership, right? There is potentially one person that is an obstacle or one set of disincentives. So I would think about it in terms of like, what are the incentives that we need to change, right? And potentially that can change leadership. And then also saying, okay, is one leader having an issue? How is there other leaders that we can have as champions? So I will still start thinking about the top. It's true that we grassroots can sometimes make change, but when we think about organizational change, typically you need to think about leadership support and having champions at the top. So yeah, hope that helps.
So Tina, here is a question for you from Manali Purohit, who asks, how are governments adapting communication strategies to learn more about what people need and addressing them to ensure the well-being of the population? And I think this goes right to where you've been bringing us back to, which is equity and making sure that that when we talk about failure, we do so with deep respect, that there are people literally whose lives are at stake. And so we just have to be thoughtful and center those folks.
Great question. I know that here in Seattle, we've been pretty intentional, and there's always room for improvement. So lots of opportunity to get better, but we've been trying to listen and engage with those voices that haven't typically had a seat at the table. And that is disproportionately communities of color, right? And so I think there's a lot of ways to do that. We've been engaging more with like grassroots media and the not mainstream media, and have found that to be a great opportunity to listen and for us to learn, and then to also just engage in dialogue to ensure that there is a connection point with our residents. I'll also share that we've been employing something that I know the Failing Forward report mentions. It's a core part of how we work here in Seattle, which is human-centered design, to go out and listen For example, we had an outbreak in June of COVID that was associated with the young adults at the University of Washington. So right now we are in the midst of a design sprint where we're interviewing those young adults to understand what do they need to better understand how to navigate this time. What supports, what are we not giving them right now that they would benefit from? So I think just as many strategies fit an organization's needs that allow you to go out and listen and engage with those voices who typically aren't coming to city council meetings or to hearings.
Great. So this is a question from Jason Whittet, who has a lot of experience working in and around local government. And he asks, what are the best mechanisms for turning intention into action in urban innovation? Josh, what does that stepwise process look like to you?
Well, I think it starts with mindsets and beliefs, right? I think you need to, and then we talked about this in our report, you need to start with building the right mindsets that allow you to drive, that allow you to acknowledge failures and then believe that you can actually then do something about it. And we also talked about the need for having strong human relationships, everything that people have talked about before, about the need for leaders to communicate clearly and show vulnerability and show that it's okay to learn from failure. But to me, that doesn't do much unless you have systems and processes that can actually underpin that, right? So you can say like, hey, let's take some time and let's reflect and learn from what's not going well and then think about how we can do something about it. But most people that work in and around in local government will describe it as, you know, playing like a game of whack-a-mole where you're just kind of constantly putting out fires, and there isn't that time. It's the Mayor Lucas talked about it as well, about, you know, always being really busy, but that's not an excuse. And I think we need to find ways to build in the time and space for people to reflect, and then have that same time and space for them to drive that reflection into actual action. And then something that Neil talked about as well is, I think, changing the incentive structures around that can actually reward responsible risk-taking for the sake of developing solutions in the long term.
Sarah, I'll put that question to you as well. What are the best mechanisms for turning intention into action in the realm of urban innovation?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Josh that actually some systemic incentives, not just because actually changing incentives does change behavior, but because in setting in place new incentives, you've gone through quite a sort of wide consultation process within your organization such that this is going to stick. It's not going to be unpicked by the finance department or, you know, the mayor or someone else. Like in putting in place bonuses for people who shut down projects, for example, which is what we have at X, you have to have some sort of agreement. The other thing I'd suggest, and I mean, this is obviously something that we do a lot of, finding a partner to innovate with is often a good way to kickstart some of that. You know, it gives you an ally to go out with in the public to say, look, we're working with some experts or some people who've done this before. It also brings with it some best practice. You want to make sure they're going to stick with you. You want to make sure that you are all aligned in your goals and they've got the appetite for public sector innovation. But I often think that's quite a nice way also to get leaders on side who may be a little bit uncertain. You know, every reluctant leader loves a moment in the PR sun. So it tends to help get them on board as well and give them confidence that they're not going to be out on their own. Often leaders who are reluctant to change things are scared. And so you need to find ways to bolster their confidence that although there is risk and although failure is going to be part of the process, there is a win at the end of it. The process itself is going to get them something good.
Great. I wish we could keep talking about this subject hour upon hour, but people do have things to do. And one of the things we try to do at Aspen is hold trust by keeping to time. So I will just say thanks to all of our extraordinary panelists. Thanks enormously to Mayor Lucas and his team for showing up with the best of local government, which is humility, vulnerability, and honesty, because local government is a deeply human endeavor. And the more that we recognize our own humanity, including failure, the better we will be able to serve humans who are the end and the reason why local government exists. So thanks so much. We'll have a recording of this out either later today or tomorrow, and you will all get it. We welcome your tweets and your feedback at Aspen Urban Inno. Thanks so much. Have a great day.